going to talk about the role of some of the cerebral nuclei. Remember, nuclei are collections of neuron cell bodies somewhere in the central nervous system, like deep in the central nervous system. So these cerebral nuclei can receive impulses from the cortex as well as the limbic system. And they have a lot of output that goes to the primary motor cortex. And then from the primary motor cortex, it can provide this background of pattern movements that's necessary for conscious motor activity, as well as adjusting motor commands and other nuclei. So what we see here then, you guys, for a lot of these cerebral nuclei, like the putamen and the globus pallidus and the thalamus here, which has a lot of nuclei, many of these are involved with your motor and sensory systems. You know, your thalamus does receive a lot of sensory input. Other nearby nuclei we call the basal ganglia, includes things like your putamen, caudate nucleus, and globus pallidus. These are involved with movement. And so when you think about like very precise, directed, stereotyped movements, things like riding a bike, you know, it's going to involve these basal ganglia. And disorders of the basal ganglia then will be movement disorders. So you think of like Parkinson's disease, it affects the basal ganglia. You know, they have difficulty initiating and just general movements. So now there's a communication though with these cerebral nuclei with other brain centers like the cortex as well as your cerebellum down here. And output goes down your spinal cord down to some muscle. Now the cerebellum continuously receives input from different sensory and motor pathways. So it receives input from different sensory systems. Remember we talked about how there were sensory pathways that carried information to your cerebellum, like we had our spinocerebellar pathway, where it carried postural information to the cerebellum. Well, the cerebellum gets that information and uses it for processing, right? For instance, like how does your body know your current position, like if you're riding a bike? Well, it gets it from the spinocerebellar pathway. It gets sent to the cerebellum, where the cerebellum can process that. But here's the other thing cool too, you guys, is that the cerebellum can also process the descending motor information. So what the cerebellum can do is actually fact check. It kind of checks what's being sent out to your muscle and make sure that that's correct. So let's say if you started to do something incorrectly, like you're riding a bike and you started to make the wrong adjustment, right? Well, the cerebellum could check that as the information is going down. Now, it can't prevent it from continuing on, but what it can do is check it, make sure it's correct. And if it's incorrect, it can generate error-correcting signals that get sent back up to the frontal lobe, then from the frontal lobe back down to skeletal muscle. And you can do the right thing and maybe not wobble your handlebars and then just keep your handlebars steady, right? So it's pretty cool. Your cerebellum is sort of constantly monitoring what your body's doing in order to more precisely, have a better motor behavior. Now, when the cerebellum detects a disparity between like an intended and actual movement, it can generate an error-correcting signal. Like an example of this would be, let's say if you're shooting a basketball, and as you're going to shoot that basketball, what your cerebellum realizes then is that your arms are actually not in their correct position to achieve your goal, right? Then what the cerebellum can do then is make the appropriate adjustment to your arms. That way, as you're shooting, like it might even make the adjustment as you're shooting to make sure you actually get to your goal. So it generates these error-correcting signals in real time. And it generates them really rapidly too, guys. We're talking about fractions of a second, like in the order of milliseconds, like thousands of a second. It can generate these error-correcting signals so that we actually do the right thing, which is pretty cool. Now the signal is transmitted to the premotor area, which is your frontal lobe, and other primary motor cortices, like your primary motor cortex, and through the thalamus to the brainstem, and then out to muscle. So what this slide is showing you guys is basically how this processing works. Let's say that let's just run with the idea of the whole idea, like shooting a basketball. Let's say you make the decision, okay, I'm gonna throw this basketball in that hoop, right? Well, that whole idea of planning and intending to do that motor behavior occurs in the frontal lobe in the premotor cortex. Okay, what happens then is that from the premotor cortex, voluntary movements, that information is sent to the primary motor cortex. From the primary motor cortex, information sent down through the thalamus, along through the midbrain, down through the brainstem. Okay, but then some of this information is actually sent to the cerebellum. Then what the cerebellum does is actually checks to make sure that that motor output is correct. And if it's incorrect, it can process the information. Well, whether it's not incorrect or correct, it can actually process this information. Okay, and if it is incorrect, it can actually send information back up to your frontal lobe, where then you can generate an error-correcting signal and then make an adjustment that's then sent back down through your brainstem. This is done in real time. And what's also done on top of this, you guys, is in yellow, this is showing the ascending input from your spinocerebellar pathway. So your cerebellum's also getting information about what your body's current position is, right? So let's say that you want to shoot a basketball, but let's say if you're kind of like leaning to the side a little bit. Well, your cerebellum gets that information, and it understands then that, okay, your body position isn't just upright and you're not on 2 feet, right? So if you're leaning to the side a little bit, then you might need to shoot that basketball a little differently to actually make it in the hoop, right? So the cerebellum gets that information about your current body state from the spinocerebellar pathway, and it uses that information with the intended movement to generate an error-correcting signal that's sent back up to the frontal lobe, and then adjustments are made if necessary. And then guess what? Then they make the basket. So that's pretty cool. So it's amazing, and this is done extremely fast, you guys. It's done so fast, you can't just recognize this sort of processing in somebody doing a particular activity. Like this sort of processing occurs in fractions of a second, and it can't be recorded like on video. Like you won't see somebody like move their arm really quickly. It's very quick, and it's going to occur so smoothly. It's going to already look like that was actually their intended actual movement, right? Although it actually is that they are making adjustments in real time. So it's really neat, and I don't know, it just blows my mind. So in terms of levels of processing of motor control, you guys, we have simple reflexes, which is just basically like their patellar tendon reflex. You tap the patellar tendon, leg kicks out. That's very simple processing. Now, there are some nuclei that control reflexes in the spinal cord and brainstem. Some of these reflexes are more complex, though. And so some reflexes include complex movements like walking. Gait or movement, like walking, actually is a reflex. In fact, the evidence for this is if you put someone with spinal cord injury, like if they're quadriplegic, if you put them on a treadmill, they can walk on their own on that treadmill. But it's the treadmill that has to get their legs moving. But once the legs are moving, they will start to move like how they should, right, as they're walking. But it's not because their brain's controlling their legs. It's because the legs are moving in a reflex pattern, right? As one leg moves in a particular way, it starts affecting the other leg to move in another way. And it's actually done in a reflex manner in the absence of your brain. And so there's some early studies of this way back in the day where some early physiologists would do stuff like basically sever the spinal cord of a cat, right? And then they put that cat on a treadmill, and the cat legs would actually walk on their own, right? But the spinal cord severed. It is. I mean, it does seem kind of cruel, right? And so this is sort of like science, and a lot of stuff is done for the sake of science. Unfortunately, a lot of what we know about the human body is actually from the animal studies. But more complex movements include walking too, which is actually a reflex. So it's pretty cool.
But there has to be like some body support there.
There is, yeah. And so these complex unconscious motor patterns are controlled by neurons in your cerebellum, nuclei, and midbrain. And these things can be modified, right? So if walking is a reflex, you can modify the way you walk using your brain. But an example of like a cat whose spinal cord's been severed surgically, although they can move their legs in a walking fashion or manner, they won't use their brain to modify that gait. So they're more likely to trip and that kind of stuff, if that makes sense. Otherwise, your cerebellum, cerebral nuclei like your basal ganglia and midbrain are all involved in helping to modify these reflexes. And that way, you can change them, which is actually pretty cool. Now, highly variable and complex motor patterns are controlled by your cortex, which is going to be the highest level of processing and motor control. So when you're able to think about how to do a motor behavior or action, that's going to involve your higher order brain centers like the premotor cortex of your frontal lobe, or the primary motor cortex of your frontal lobe, which is the precentral gyrus. Other things that you don't need to even consider, those don't involve higher order processing. It's pretty cool. The evidence for this too, you guys, is the fact that if I asked you all to go do a motor behavior, but also have to think about like complex problems, you have difficulty doing both. Like if I asked you guys to go do a bunch of somersaults in the grass outside, and followed by 10 cartwheels and 6 leapfrogs while doing math equations in your head, you would have trouble doing both at the same time. Because it actually takes some brain power to think about how to do those movements, and that brain power is occupied during that period of time. You might be able to get the math done, but chances are you're going to be more likely to be incorrect and do it more slowly than if you were just sitting there and not moving at all. So think about like if you're hyper-focused, you don't move your body, right? That's the point, is that you don't want to have to think about how to move your body. You can actually use that other brain matter then for other sorts of processing. Yes?
Is that the same sort of thing as like when you like rub your stomach and tap your head kind of thing, like doing two things at once, why it's hard to do them?
Yeah, it's similar. Exactly, yeah. So yeah, like rubbing your stomach and tapping your head at the same time is difficult unless you've practiced it. If you've practiced it a lot, then you're probably really good at it because now you don't use higher order brain centers because you don't have to think about it. It's actually more of like a reflex pathway, which is actually pretty cool. And so these things can change, they can mold. What could normally be a complex behavior can actually eventually become simple the more and more you practice it because you actually form muscle memory of this. You know, that information is stored in your cerebellum.
So it's why like you can like the same, right? If I get back on after you're not riding a bike and still know how to do it.
Yeah. You get muscle memory, yeah. So, you know, if you're going to make a decision about whether or not to tap your head and rub your belly, right, that's going to occur in the frontal lobes. That information is then going to send to the motor association areas, like your primary motor cortex. From there, that information is sent to cerebral nuclei and your cerebellum. And once you start to actually perform that motor activity, it's fact-checked by your cerebellum, which stores a memory of those movements to make sure you're actually doing the correct thing. You know, we've all encountered the circumstance where in our minds we think we can do something, but then when you go to carry it out using your body, it doesn't meet reality, right? You think, oh yeah, I can't. I'm totally gonna jump over this ravine. I'm gonna make it, right? then you find, oh no, right? Midway, you don't make it. You're just in the mud. You're just covered in mud. You know, I don't know if it's ever happened to you guys, but I'm pretty sure it's happened to me. Yeah, I seen that one, and she falls in. Yeah. She almost made it.
And then her dog is like reacting on the side.
Yeah. So, you know, the decision to jump over that ravine would be the frontal lobes, and then the information is, you know, sent out to your muscles, but then it's checked by your cerebellum. And if there's any error discrepancy, then the cerebellum can generate error correcting signals that are sent to your cerebral nuclei and other, you know, motor association areas. Now, we're going to do next, guys, move on to some higher order processing and integrative functions. Higher order mental functions include things like learning, memory, reasoning, as well as consciousness, or the self-awareness. These functions can occur within the cortex of the cerebrum, and they involve multiple brain regions. So it's hard to say like the learning and memory center of your brain, or the center of consciousness. Typically, all of these things are distributed across your cortex, which is good in the sense that if you do get damage to the cortex, you might not just all of a sudden lose your sense of consciousness yourself. Right? Or you might not just be totally unable to learn new things or remember anything. So the fact that we don't have one specific center for learning, memory, reasoning, or consciousness is actually an advantage to us in the sense that you can accommodate for damage. Now, both conscious and unconscious processing of information are involved with any sort of activity. In fact, it's suspected that a lot of our mental processing is actually more on the unconscious side than the conscious side. If you guys have read this book called Blink, they talk about it there. How we do a tremendous amount of unconscious processing that we don't even think about. But where this ever bubbles up into our consciousness is that idea you get like a gut feeling about something. When you get that gut feeling, it's sort of the idea that there's some unconscious processing that's bubbling up into your consciousness and you don't feel good about it, or you do feel good about it, right? But there's more complex processing that is occurring in unconscious ways. Yeah. There's a lot of, yeah. So the myth that you only use 10% of your brain comes from people who don't know how to interpret science. So I think there was a paper that was published some years back that found that at any specific moment, you know, they found that from EEG studies that they can only record electrical activities in about 10% of the surface area of the brain at any specific moment in time, right? But that doesn't mean you only use 10% of your brain. That just means at any specific moment, on average, you might only be using about 10%. But even that's not true. What we find is, you know, it can vary about how much of your brain you're using at any specific moment. And so you actually use all of your brain. There's none of your brain that's unused. You use it all. You just can't use it all at the same time. That wouldn't make sense, right? It'd be like trying to recall every single memory that you've ever had at once. Obviously, we don't do that, right? But we use all of our brain. And there's a lot of myths. There's another myth too. You guys this whole myth about learning styles. Like people say, I'm an auditory learner or I'm a visual learner. That's also a myth that's been perpetuated by people who don't know how to interpret science. So it's kind of interesting. Now, there's a hemispheric lateralization, and hemispheric lateralization refers to this idea that that certain functions can exist on either half of the cerebral hemisphere. And there's, although this is fairly true, it's also not always concretely this way, right? So this is just sort of a disclaimer, you guys. Although we'll say that, for the most part, Broca's area, which is the motor speech area, is mostly found in the left frontal lobe. It's not always there. It can sometimes be on the right side too. So these things can be switched. But for the most part, individuals will exhibit functions localized to specific hemispheres. And this is the idea between like right brain versus left brain. You hear about people say, oh, I'm really right-brained. Well, that means something with respect to typical functions of the right side of your cerebral hemisphere. Or if someone says, oh, I'm left-brained, and that means something with respect to typical functions of the left cerebral hemisphere. But again, they're typical, not absolute, which means that if you say that language is always in the left cerebral hemisphere, that's actually incorrect. It involves both hemispheres. Or if you say that reasoning and artistic ability and musical ability is only involved with the right cerebral hemisphere, that's mostly true, but it's also incorrect. So it's just sort of disclaimer, you guys. And so, I mean, we're talking about an average here. So in most people, about 95% of the population, the left cerebral hemisphere is called the categorical hemisphere. As the categorical hemisphere, what it does is it's involved with speech because it contains Wernicke's and Broca's area. Remember, Wernicke's area was the part of your temporal lobe that's involved with understanding written and spoken language. Broca's area was the motor speech area, part of your frontal lobe, that's involved with speech production. But they're side by side, and they have similar functions, right? So Wernicke's is for speech recognition, Broca's is for speech production. And other things that are found in the left cerebral hemisphere would be things like performing sequential and analytical tasks, math included. Solving a mathematical equation involves sequential and analytical functions, which is most likely located in the left cerebral hemisphere. But again, this is not totally true, but it kind of runs this pattern. Partitioning of information into smaller fragments for analysis also occurs in the left cerebral hemisphere. The idea of this then would be separating out a lot of information into small bits that we can kind of recall it and learn it in more analytical ways. Now, the right cerebral hemisphere is also called the representational hemisphere, and it's typically involved with visuospatial relationships and analyses. So we talk about the right cerebral hemisphere as being like the seat of imagination and insight and musical and artistic ability and perception of patterns and spatial relationships, right, which would be good if you're artistic. Or comparison of sights, sounds, smells, and tastes. Again, that would be good if you're artistic, right, like have artistic abilities. So if you guys had to describe yourself as one or the other, would you say that you're more categorical or more representational? What do you think? You guys say categorical? Yeah. Would anybody say that they're more representational because they're better at like imagining things or they're good at musical ability?
Pretty equally balanced.
Exactly. This is why it's a myth when people say, oh, I'm left-brained. Because there's never a circumstance where someone totally lacks any kind of insight, totally lacks any kind of artistic skill at all, totally lacks any kind of perception of patterns or spatial relationships, right? But when we say that, if we say left brain, we're saying that they are categorical dominant, right? That their personality traits are more consistent with the categorical hemisphere. Like they're more likely to be analytical individuals that are good at speech production and recognition, that kind of stuff, okay? As well as putting things into little sequential putting things in little categories, hence the name categorical hemisphere. Or there might be individuals that, due to their personality, like they're sort of more representational in the sense that they live their lives in more of an artistic way. They're focused more on spatial relationships. They care about aesthetics rather than analysis. And so you're never going to find somebody who's only representational or only categorical. Typically, we're a blend of the two, right? And they have those little tests online that says, what brain are you, right or left, right? Take that stuff with a grain of salt, right? Because with like 20 question tests, how much can you really glean about somebody from 20 questions? You're not going to learn anything. So, but what this is showing you guys is basically that whole idea between hemispheric lateralization. So the left cerebral hemisphere in 95% of people is the categorical hemisphere. So that's going to be involved with speech. as well as language and performing analytical functions. The right cerebral hemisphere in 95% of people is the representational hemisphere, and that's involved with things like visuospatial relationships, aesthetic qualities, recognizing patterns and sights and sounds, and that's going to correlate then with musical ability and that kind of stuff. Okay. Now, later on when we get to the sensory systems, we'll learn about then is how each cerebral hemisphere receives information from each eye, because the eyes, their information actually crosses. So some of the information from your right eye goes to both the right and the left cerebral hemispheres, and some of the information from your left eye also goes to the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. And we'll talk about that later. Now, in terms of hand control, we talk about that most tracks decussate or cross, right? So if you're, what do you guys think the right primary motor cortex is going to control? Your right hand or left hand? Your left hand, you got it. So what if someone gets damage to their right primary motor cortex? Where might you see paralysis? Probably the left side of their body, right? Good. And if someone gets damage to the left side of their brain, like the left cerebral hemisphere, then they might lose functions on the right side, if that makes sense. But that's true for 90% of the cases, if that makes sense. Now, both cerebral hemispheres remain in constant communication, especially through the commissures. Remember, it's a big old white matter tract, like the corpus callosum. And cerebral lateralization is highly correlated with handedness. So typically, right-handed individuals have a tendency to have different types of lateralization than left-handed individuals. What's also interesting too, you guys, is that left-handedness runs in families. It also correlates with twins. So if you have a twin, you're more likely to be left-handed.